So I have finally done it. I have read everything written by Glen Cook with a couple DNFs that we'll get into as we go through this tier ranking. Now, before I start the tier ranking, I just want to talk about why I did this and my overall thoughts about Glen Cook's writing. I decided to do this because no one else has, and I really wanted to create a guide for everyone out there who is new to Glen Cook so that they can figure out where to start, figure out what they should read, what they shouldn't read from his bibliography, because this man has written a lot. I have 53 books up here. I thought it was 52. Some are absolutely amazing. Some of the best stuff you could ever read in science fiction or fantasy. Others are stinkers that no one should read. So before I dive into that, I just want to talk about what I have learned about his writing as I have done this. The first thing you need to know about Glen Cook is he does not care about anything but telling the story he wants to tell. He's not trying to lean on any specific themes. He's not trying to subvert tropes. He just wants to tell stories. In every interview with him, people will ask him, what does this mean in your book? Or what is the theme in this other book? And he just says stuff like, I was just telling a story. It had no deeper meaning. I don't know if he's just gaslighting everyone when he says that, but I do find it funny. I think he's sincere when he says he just wants to tell stories and that there is no subtext in his writing. Now, I don't think that's true because Stephen King has said it multiple times, and especially in his book on writing, about the craft of writing, that an author even unintentionally puts themes and subtext into their novels. So even if he's not intending to do it, it's there. I guess one of the nice things is that there is no accepted interpretation because the author himself says you're wasting your time. So it makes it a lot more fun to read that way, and you can interpret it however you want. And when he gets asked about that stuff, he just says it doesn't matter. He's like, just enjoy your stories and then go read something else. He likes to say things like, stop wasting time with that literati crap. Speaking of literati crap, when it comes to his writing style, his biggest influence is John D. MacDonald. I've now read 15 John D. MacDonald books, and it couldn't be more obvious. Glen Cook has said repeatedly that MacDonald is one of his favorite authors. He's mentioned in an interview that he owns every John D. MacDonald book published, and you can see it in his writing. I made a video about it, reading my favorite author's favorite author. Go check that out, and I just talk about all this. But to go back over it a little, John D. MacDonald does a really good job of writing sharp, punchy prose, and Glen Cook does the same thing. Another thing that John D. MacDonald does is write in a way that pulls you into the story through his wonderful descriptive prose of the environments and the feelings of those places and the feelings those places give to the POV character. He writes in a way that really leaves you immersed in the story. Sometimes he will describe a scene or give a little internal monologue that is so beautiful it makes you pause for a moment and just appreciate that it exists. Glen Cook does the same thing to a greater degree in some of his books like The Dread Empire, and to a lesser degree in things like The Black Company. The writing is still beautiful, but they're very different in tone, and I think that's another great thing about his writing overall is it's varied. It's varied in a way that is almost disruptive with some of his works, and I'll get to that as I rank them. Also, he does not care if you understand what is going on. He's not going to hold your hand. He's just going to put you there, and you are going to figure it out, especially in The Black Company. And the reason being, when it comes to The Black Company, is the novel is built around it being the shorthand of the analyst for the Black Company. He's essentially recording the history of the mercenary company, so he has no incentive to explain what's going on. Like, if you're reading the annals, then you already know what the jewel cities are, or you know who Kina is. So he doesn't do a lot of explaining, but I feel like that makes you more immersed in the story, and it's not like he's writing in a way to make it hard to follow. It's just you have to accept that you're not going to know everything, but eventually with the help of context, you'll figure it out. In some of his works, he does get like very exposition heavy, like to the detriment of the works, but in others, it is written in a way that the narrator itself has a personality when it's giving you these expositions, and the Dread Empire series does that, and I really like it. It reminds me of an older style of fantasy writing that people don't really do anymore. The other thing is, like, I think a lot of people get turned off by his style. He writes very short sentences. Some people have jokingly said that it's like he was allergic to commas, but I think the writing style allows him to manipulate the pacing in his novels in a way that I don't see in a lot of other books. He can have these rapid fire sentences followed by a long sentence that's just flowing and beautiful and kind of resets your expectations of how events are going to take place and the speed at which they're happening. And then he can go right back to it. Every time I notice it, I have more appreciation for it. He's so good at manipulating the structure of the words on the page. I've heard people say that his writing is hard to read, and I have no idea how you can come to that conclusion. Occasionally, he'll drop like a graduate school test level vocabulary word into his writing or something, but they're really easy to figure out with context clues. And honestly, if you clipped those out of his writing and put his works into one of those apps that tells you what reading level stuff is, it's like 9th grade, 10th grade tops. His writing is not complex. It's very easy to breeze through. I think what bothers people is he does not waste time writing between the destinations. So if he was writing about me going to the mall, it would have been what I was doing before I drove to the mall and then me getting to the mall. He's not going to write about me driving and zoning out and listening to podcasts or something. He just doesn't want to waste time doing that stuff. Like, there are events in the book that are part of the journey, but he will skip days, weeks. It doesn't matter. If it gets in the way of telling the story, then he's not going to write it down. Like, he doesn't like bloat his novels, which I have a appreciation for. I mean, the entire 10-book Dread Empire series is shorter than 2 Stormlight Archive books or 2 Malazan books. Like a 10-book epic fantasy series. It's awesome. And, now with all that out of the way, let's get right into ranking every Glen Cook novel ever published, other than his smut novel that was written under another name, so I don't think it counts. Also, I can't find a copy. I can't even find like a ebook copy. There's no way to source one unless I just happen to stumble upon one. Glen Cook doesn't even own a copy anymore because his got stolen. So probably never going to read his smut novel, which is maybe for the best. I don't know. Anyways, let's start ranking. His first novel, The Heirs of Babylon, published in 1972, is C tier, almost DNF tier. Like, the story itself is interesting. I just don't think it's written very well. I like the characters, and I have a real appreciation for the ship that it's taking place on. The premise is this is post-apocalyptic Europe, like after however many world wars. Essentially, every couple of decades, the whole world goes to war again. And it's like this endless war, very 1984 feeling in some ways. And there's almost nothing left. Technology is almost completely gone. This is a ship from World War II, and this is, 800 years later or something. It's barely being held together. It was the ship that he served on in the Navy, which is cool. He decided to use that as a source material. And I don't know. It's like a post-apocalyptic military novel, but is actually like a murder mystery or a whodunit, and I didn't really enjoy the twist much. There are these moments that are just absolutely shocking, but this novel was originally developed as like a little story at like the Clarion like writing group academy thing. I can't remember. He was in that group with some no names like Octavia Butler and stuff. So, anyways, this was like a little short thing that he turned into a novel, and it's okay, especially for like a first novel, but anyone who's new to Glen Cook, I would not suggest this one at all. Next, we have A Shadow of All Night Falling, book 1 of the Dread Empire series from 1979. There was like a big gap in his publishing, which probably has to do with him working a full-time job his entire writing career. He was not a full-time writer until he retired, like the mid-2000s. So keep that in mind. A Shadow of All Night Falling is B tier, maybe A tier. This is the first book in the Dread Empire series in publication order, but don't read them that way. I have a guide for how to read them, and I'll link that in the description. But anyways, this novel's fine. I just think that it's hard to be invested in it because you don't really know what's going on because Glen Cook drops you right in there. And also, it's just weird. It's really, really weird. I would almost call it experimental in the way it is written, and it's the only one like that in the series. I enjoy it, but the other books in the series are so much better that it's got to be in B tier. Speaking of the next book in the series, October's Baby, that is A tier, and it is very strange. Everything about the Dread Empire is epic fantasy, but like written by a guy who does not care about tropes. He does whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and these were a huge influence for Malazan, and you can tell with like the overall world building and the tone, like the grittiness of the setting. And October's Baby is really good, but there's a couple of S tier Dread Empire novels, so I don't want to put this in A tier. And speaking of another A tier, like All Darkness Met, I mentioned it in my review of this series, review/guide, that these books have some kind of slow moments. One thing you will notice with Glen Cook is he's kind of inconsistent with pacing. He tends to just lag at about 60% of the way through a book, and you've got like a slog somewhere in the second half of almost all his books. Usually it's not bad. Fortunately, in the Dread Empire series, it's almost always involved with like military fiction stuff going on. So it's like battles and the way people are being maneuvered and stuff like that. If you're into that, these books will have no slow moments. But if you're not into that, sometimes it's hard to push through. Now, All Darkness Met is when I realized that this series is going to go places that I would have never expected an epic fantasy series to go. Funny enough, the Dread Empire in the series is like the most boring part, but yeah, All Darkness Met is definitely A tier. And I forgot to mention like the premise of this. The premise is that there's like the Dread Empire, and then a lot of this takes place in the equivalent of like Europe, like France or something. It's just a lot of politics and maneuvering. You follow 3 characters through basically the entire series. One is Bragi, who is like a Viking son or something like that, kind of. And then you follow Mocker, who is literally Kruppa from Malazan. Like the way that Mocker talks, like Erickson has to have just copy pasted that overall tone and weirdness to Kruppa, and it's just so weird. And the third character I actually want to keep as like a mystery because he comes and goes, so I don't want to include him in this because it is kind of a spoiler. Like All Darkness Met, I originally gave like 3.5 stars, but the more I think about it, the more I like this series. I was like looking over my notes as I was kind of putting together everything I read in 2024, and I have like very fond memories of reading this series. Now the next one, The Sword Bearer. This is in DNF for me. I read 60% of it and I just don't like it. It doesn't sound like Glen Cook, which is a theme with his standalones. For some reason, his standalones are like never good. This book was like Glen Cook's traditional hero's journey, but it has like the trope of sapient swords, and the sword is like messed up. And of course, the action scenes are like fast paced and the premise is cool, but like the rest of the pacing is just very slow and the characters are mediocre. There's like an interesting twist in the book that's like a shocking moment, but I don't know if it's worth reading unless you've run out of other Glen Cook stuff to read, which was kind of what happened to me. Next is Shadowline, and holy crap. Like I talk about these in another video where I read 5 Glen Cook novels in a single week, because Shadowline, book 1 in the Starfishers trilogy, is S tier. Glen Cook is a master of science fiction, which is weird considering he's only known for The Black Company and some other fantasy, but his science fiction, holy crap. The book has some flaws, like the cast is like way too big for a book of its size and the pacing suffers because of it, but we get our normal middle of the book Glen Cook slump, but it happens in like the first half, like at the beginning of the book, which is not good for a book 1, but the world is interesting, and if you can get through that, the rest of it is a very good military science fiction novel. And here's the thing about the Starfishers trilogy. The first book has nothing to do with the other 2. I don't know why it's there. Well, I kind of do. They're just loosely related, like as loosely related as another book that takes place in this series. Something I want to point out real quick. We're working on like 1980 to 1982 right now, Glen Cook. This man from 1980 to 1989 wrote 26 novels, like 6 of which were Black Company novels, some of the best stuff he's ever written. All of his science fiction was written during this time, and 4 of those 5 science fiction novels are some of the best science fiction I've ever read in my life. Like, this man was working full-time for General Motors and raising a family, and also published 26 novels in a 10-year span. Like, I don't know how else to explain that he's like one of the GOATs. It's just ridiculous that he put out such high quality work as a hobby. It's just incredible. But anyways, let's keep going. Next, we got Starfishers. Starfishers is where this really takes off. Starfishers is amazing. I could not believe it when I got to it. I was hoping that the series would improve after Shadowline, but I did not expect this. The characters are so good, and his future history of mankind just feels lived in. It feels real. We get these little hints of like what came before humanity, is like these teasers of like ancient civilizations in space and stuff. And we also tackle like what it means to not be the only sapient creature in the galaxy. And it's just so good. I started it and finished it. No stops, 7 hours. That was it. I just crushed it. It was so good. I immediately started book 3, which was Star's End. By the way, all of these books were published in the same year. This man wrote a trilogy and it was all published in the same year. And Star's End was just as good, if not better. It was all of Glen Cook's strengths as a writer and almost none of the weaknesses. There's no mid-book slog. Like, I don't want to get into the details of this one because I don't really want to spoil them, but I think that overall this trilogy is one of the best things Glen Cook has written. It is one of my suggestions for where you start when reading Glen Cook. If you like science fiction more than fantasy, start with the Starfishers trilogy. If you like fantasy, of course, Black Company, but this is as good as some of the best Black Company novels. And the other thing I want to say about Star's End is we get more of that like future history, looking at like humanity in space and how things would be different, and another glimpse of ancient spacefaring civilizations, and just a lot of really good stuff. And one of the things that a lot of people don't really know is Glen Cook is so good at writing like heartfelt, beautiful moments, and this series has them. Like Starfishers, when I finished it, I was crying. And then with Star's End, it just had these beautiful moments too. It's so rare that I get a writer that literally writes the vibe in a way that just is breathtaking. And he does it in here. Every once in a while, you just get hit with this magnificent prose that you do not expect from a grimdark fantasy writer, or B, a science fiction writer who's just kind of writing whatever he wants. Now, after that, we've got The Fire in His Hands. Now, The Fire in His Hands is the first prequel in the Dread Empire series, and it should be read first because a lot of the characters that are in the original Dread Empire trilogy start here. But the problem is if you've read that trilogy first, you know who survived, and all of the suspense is gone from this book. So I suggest you start here because this sets up everything basically that happens in the Dread Empire series. And he had planned this whole series. This was his big epic fantasy where he had everything written down, exactly what he wanted, where everything was. Everybody had a biography, all that stuff. This is the only time he did that, as far as I know. He's actually an exploratory writer. This man is writing some of the best fantasy, amazingly crafted storylines, just flying at the seat of his pants. So anyways, start here. It has to do with a holy war in his fantasy equivalent of the Middle East, and I like it. I will say the same thing that only the best in fantasy has said. It is very obvious that this is where the 7 cities come from in Malazan, like to the point that it's almost more than an homage, but I don't think Glen Cook or Steven Erikson care. Let's move on to The Black Company. Yes, The Black Company is S tier, and a lot of people would probably put it a little lower, but I've read the book 5 times. It moves at a breakneck pace, and it is such a magnificent fantasy novel. It has a just overall tone that you almost never see in fantasy. You see people trying to do it, and it's like a mockery, but it's just so good. And this book, it was such a refreshing read to me. I was kind of burnt out on fantasy at the time, and I had heard about this somewhere, I don't know, probably Reddit or something, when I was looking for stuff to read because I was just burnt out on normal epic fantasy. And man, this book was just revelatory. And that leads to Shadows Linger, which is probably my favorite book in the Black Company series. It's especially my favorite in the first half. Shadows Linger is a gothic horror novel. It is a story about making decisions that lead to other decisions that put you on a path of darkness that you can't get out of. And you're slowly slipping deeper and deeper into this pit of despair. And like I said, there's no way out. And it's horrifying, some of the things that happen in this. And this is one of those books where Glen Cook really shows off how shit happens. He talks about that in an essay he wrote for Writing Fantasy Heroes, where sometimes something happens to your main character and you have to figure out how to adapt and move on. You can't rewrite your story to make sure that character doesn't die, because the reader will know, they will feel it, and it will affect the quality of your writing. And in here, shit happens and it sucks. It's also so good. There is a scene in here of regular dudes fighting essentially a borderline immortal wizard, and it's like a horror movie. It was essentially them fighting like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or something when he's in like his OP mode. Not quite Jason X stupidity, but imagine someone absolutely relentless and you have these squad of dudes who are trying to take him down and he's just wrecking. It's so good. It's so terrifying, and I loved it. Now on to some bad news. I'm going to go ahead and throw all these in here at once, even though they're partially out of chronological order. We're going to go Doomstalker, Warlock, and Ceremony, part of the Dark War trilogy. It is a science fantasy series that reads nothing like anything else Glen Cook has written. I think it's some of his weaker work. It has very interesting concepts. It is about this young, non-human woman. Glen Cook does a really good job of writing interesting aliens, but the problem is like she ends up getting like taken captive or something, and she's moved to this place where they make like powerful psychic or magic users or something, and there's like advanced technology, and then she starts to kind of figure out that where she was living this primitive life, it's almost like a nature preserve for people, and then she kind of gets radicalized against the establishment that has taken her in, and then over the span of the story she becomes the establishment, and there's like really messed up stuff that goes on, but I did not like them at all. I read the first two and I DNF'd the last one because I don't like them. They don't read like anything Glen Cook has written before or after. The tone is just wrong. The style is wrong. You'll probably notice a trend throughout this that when his books are bad, it's usually, at least for me, because they don't feel like a Glen Cook novel. With Mercy Toward None, we're going to put this one, I'm going to put this in A tier. I don't like it as much as The Fire in His Hands. They're both still very good. I think The Fire in His Hands should be treated as the first Dread Empire novel because it starts off so strong and so interesting. And With Mercy Toward None is the sequel, and it carries on this holy war that's happening between two religious sects in their equivalent of the Middle East, and it's very good. This is when you really start to get a feel for the characters that are going to be very important for the rest of the Dread Empire series. Yet again, why I suggest reading them first, and we'll go on from there. A Matter of Time. This is B tier, but don't let this affect your feeling toward the book because it's a standalone, and a B tier standalone for Glen Cook is like A or S tier for anyone else. It's just that he is not very good at writing standalones, I don't think. Or at least I didn't like any of them. A Matter of Time is very good. I ranked it pretty high on my overall in 2024 because it is a murder mystery that has to do with like time travel and weird science fiction stuff. I don't know why there's an astronaut on the cover of this one. It doesn't make any sense, but the old covers aren't good either. The premise is in like 1978, a detective is working in St. Louis in the winter and they find a warm body in an alleyway, but all signs point to the man dying in 1923, but his body is still warm. This is 1978. It looks like he took 2 steps in the snow, leaned against the wall, and died. And that is how the story starts, and it goes some crazy places. I would definitely recommend it to anyone that likes weird, like science fiction. It's not like Philip K. Dick, but it's got that same kind of like weird vibe of like The Man in the High Castle-ish. I wouldn't put it anywhere near that. I love The Man in the High Castle. I'm just saying that it's kind of that trippy alternate history, but it's like the alternate dystopian future that we never had. It's just weird. Next, we have Passage at Arms. S tier, best standalone he's ever written. This is like the pinnacle of military science fiction. I really think it's probably one of the best military SF novels ever written. It follows a journalist who was a former member of like the Navy, this like spacefaring Navy, and this is a submarine book in space. So what you have are climbers instead of like submarines. So what a climber does is it does this weird thing, a ship under a certain amount of mass, which, quick aside, there's a lot of like techno babble in this that is interesting, but sometimes it gets a little grating, but the rest of the book is so good that it just overpowers the little parts that involve this. Anyways, when a ship is under a certain amount of mass, when they flick on their basically faster than light drive, what ends up happening is, and this was an accident they discovered, they end up basically dipping into like another dimension or dipping out of our reality. But the problem is there's nothing there. You can't let off anything. You have to stay contained in your vehicle. And so these ships get hotter and hotter and hotter the longer they're climbing through like this dimension. And so you have all the stress of like a submarine, but it takes place in space. And you have this bonding of this crew and this guy who was an outsider at the beginning, slowly kind of finding his way with all these people. This book has just some of the best internal like monologues, this main character's thoughts and him just following this crew. It has some amazing naval talk. You could tell that Glen Cook took a lot of stuff from probably his experiences in the Navy and put it into this science fiction. One of the most beautiful endings I've ever read in a science fiction novel. Like, I can't recommend it enough. I would tell you to start with that if you wanted to start with something from Glen Cook that is a standalone. You don't have to know anything about the Starfishers trilogy. This is technically a prequel, but like it's a prequel in the same way that the War of 1812 is a prequel to the Civil War. Like you don't have to know anything about the War of 1812 to know what's happening in the Civil War. After that, we've got the White Rose, which is A tier. Most of the Black Company is going to be S or A tier. And this one is A tier because I don't think it's as strong as Shadows Linger, but also it doesn't have the same emotional attachment for me as the Black Company. The White Rose is a good ending to the original trilogy, and there are some moments in it that have given me like existential nightmares because of the way Glen Cook wrote it. It's part of his just like throwing you in there, and when you put the pieces together, you're just like, oh my, how? And it just broke my brain for a while. It's just great. After that, we've got Reap the East Wind, and it is the weakest book in the Dread Empire series. It's going in C. It was like a B-ish book until I read book 7. When I started this book, I just thought it was like a me problem when I was reading it. I gave serious thought to like DNFing the series because of the low points in this book. But then I got toward the end and it got really interesting and I managed to power through. I immediately started book 7 and it is everything I enjoy in the other books, but with none of these issues. The main problem with book 6, Reap the East Wind, is that it spends way too much time with the least interesting things in the series, which is the Dread Empire. They're boring. Like, I don't care about the Dread Empire stuff. All of the conflict and politics with the Dread Empire, or where the Dread Empire is like in the background, are great, but when you're actually in the Empire, it's boring. And there's like flashbacks in the first third of the book that are so similar to the original events in a previous book that I thought my audiobook was repeating the other book. This series is all of Glen Cook's strengths and weaknesses pushed to their extremes. And after that, Sweet Silver Blues, S tier. This is the first Garrett PI novel. I made a video about them. I finally read them all. Garrett is a detective in a fantasy setting, but he's like a noir style detective in a traditional fantasy series. It's so cool. It's very funny. It's goofy in places. It's emotional and heartfelt in others. And then there are very dark events that happen that mess you up. This book lives rent-free in my head. I think about the last third of this book all the time. I read it 7 years ago and I still think about it constantly. I want to read it again. I really love it, and I think of all my Glen Cook rereads, it's one of the ones I'm looking forward to the most, so I can experience Garrett from the beginning. And after that, we've got Bitter Gold Hearts, which is A tier. The early Garrett stuff are all bangers. They're all so good. I didn't even mention what Sweet Silver Blues was about. So Sweet Silver Blues is about Garrett looking for a lost woman. Doesn't know if she's been kidnapped or what, but she's gotten this big inheritance, and this very affluent family in Tunfair, which is the main city all these take place in, want Garrett to find her, either to, say she doesn't want the inheritance, or for her to come back and collect it, whatever. They just want it done. Some people want Garrett to fail at this, and so there's a lot of like conflict, not only in him finding her, but also in just all these interesting side stories. One of the best things about the Garrett novels is the cast of characters around him, and that just becomes stronger the deeper you get into the series. Bitter Gold Hearts is like a very weird trying to solve someone's been missing or someone's after this person, and it's all of the twists and turns that you see in a noir detective story just put into a fantasy world. I don't want to talk about much of the Garrett stuff too much because it's really easy to spoil a mystery like this. I just want to say that it's not quite as good as Sweet Silver Blues. That's why it's an A tier, but it's still very good. Next, we have An Ill Fate Marshalling, which is Reap the East Wind, but better in every way. It is definitely B tier, maybe almost A tier. This book makes Reap the East Wind almost a waste of time. A lot of what happened in Reap the East Wind happens in An Ill Fate Marshalling too, but from a different perspective and a better perspective. And it's just good, but this is like Glen Cook's writing in a single story kind of stretched into a series. There's just a little bit of a dip in quality, but it's not bad. It's still like a 4-star read. It's still B tier. Nothing wrong with B tier. Now that book is book 7. Did I say there were 10 in the Dread Empire? I think there's only 8. But anyways, you're going to see a big old gap between book 7 and book 8 because An Ill Fate Marshalling came out in 1988, and then someone stole his manuscript for the final trilogy he was going to write, so he just gave up on writing the series. And then he came back 24 years later and wrote the final Dread Empire novel, and it feels, I'll talk about it when we get to it. But anyways, mad props to Glen Cook for coming back to a series he had abandoned and finishing it. It's such a huge service to his fans to have taken the time to do that. And I think Nightshade Books helped because they were like, hey bro, we're republishing all of your novels. Can you finish the series? Next we have The Dragon Never Sleeps, and that's DNF. Now this is his weakest science fiction novel by a wide margin, and I think that there's just too much going on. It's got a cast that is way too large. It's very hard to follow. I was not attached to anyone. I got a third of the way through it and I was like, I don't care. I don't care what's going on. I just don't want to read this anymore. And so I ended up DNFing it. Other people have read it and they're just as confused as I am. And so I don't know. Other people think it's some of his best he's ever written. Glen Cook really likes that novel out of all of his stuff. Usually he's just like, my stuff's fine. But he said he was pretty fond of that one. And then I've heard other writers say they like that book. I don't know what they see in it, so let's just move on. Cold Copper Tears is also A tier, another Garrett novel. There are like 14 Garrett novels, and the thing about this one is it introduces some major characters that are going to be through the whole series. One of them is the new crime lord of Tunfair, and this one is just a good exploration of the city itself. You spend a lot of time pounding the pavement, meeting the different characters of the city. The city itself is a character. Every single one of these books, the city itself is changing and growing, and I just really enjoy them. I'm going to rank these really high, most of them, but if you don't like detective novels or you don't like mysteries, whodunit, stuff like that, don't even waste your time with these, but I love them. You can tell that Glen Cook is a huge fan of mystery writers like Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, John D. MacDonald. These are love letters to those style of novels, just put into a very quirky fantasy world that is his playground. Glen Cook does not care. He will put all sorts of weird stuff in these books and to be like, that's not fantasy. And it's like, well, this ain't a fantasy series. This is whatever Glen Cook wants it to be. And next up, we got Old Tin Sorrows. This one is S tier. Okay, Old Tin Sorrows is one of the books like Sweet Silver Blues I think about all the time. This is where you really start to get a grasp on like who Garrett is as a person, the motivations for him to solve things like this. There's a mysterious illness affecting a general, like a military general, and one of Garrett's Marine buddies, because Garrett's a veteran of a war that has been going on for over 100 years. You see it in the socioeconomics of the city, and it's really fascinating, this undercurrent that you're just constantly thinking about the repercussions of. Anyways, he goes to this mansion where suspects keep dying off. They're trying to figure out who has been poisoning the general and then trying to figure out who's been killing the people in the mansion. And this whole book takes place in and around a like country estate. It's very cool, very dark. This is one of the Garrett novels that has just like a melancholy to it. It's just a haunting experience. After that, we got Shadow Games, book 4 in the Black Company series, the first book of the South. It is A tier. I really like it. I think it is a great start to all the adventures after the original trilogy. You'll notice in a minute that the Silver Spike comes after this in publication order, but you need to read that before Shadow Games. It is book 3.5, basically. It takes place immediately after The White Rose. Shadow Games is the Black Company traveling the southern continent of this world. Glen Cook has never made a map. He never tells you anything except they're heading south and then describes the locations. It feels very somewhat Africa, somewhat Middle East, ending up in what is essentially the Indian subcontinent. Just real fascinating stuff. Next, we've got The Tower of Fear, which is DNF. I read about 50% of it. It reads like a pulp historical kind of. It's got very good prose, very interesting world building, but I just didn't care. The cast is way too big. The premise seems like meh at best, and so I just never felt invested in it, which is why I ended up DNFing it. If I was just reading passages to appreciate the style they're written in, I feel like he was channeling his inner Robert E. Howard or Clark Ashton Smith. I mean, no one can channel Clark Ashton Smith. He's just on another planet when it comes to pulpy prose, but in like a not insulting way. But anyways, this book has very good writing. The rest of it I just don't care about, so I had to DNF it. After that, we got The Silver Spike, which is B tier. Silver Spike's fine. I like it. It's not following the Black Company. It's not written in the same way that the other novels are. It's definitely like a 0.5 book. The events happen right after The White Rose, and it involves people stealing this artifact and it corrupting them, and a lot of it takes place in a city near the events that happened in the White Rose, and some of the characters are like scumbags. You get a little more time with Toad Killer Dog, that is one of the like most Glen Cook-ass characters in any of his books. I love him. Not much else to say about that. I don't want to spoil anything. You get some members of the original trilogy in here, but then others are like already gone. They're literally on the journey of Shadow Games while the Silver Spike is taking place. Like at some point at the end of the Silver Spike, there's something going on, and then the characters in Shadow Games are like, what's that going on way out there where we came from? And they're just like, and like that's what's happening in the Silver Spike. But yeah, it's probably one of the weaker books in the entire series. Dreams of Steel is A tier as well. This book is wild. So Shadow Games ends in like the most incredible cliffhanger of just about any series. It's just nuts. And then you get this, which just carries it on. More of the same politics. There's these new people introduced, and they are the worshippers of a death goddess, and they are this crazy assassin cult. And you're following, I can't really say because I don't want to spoil who is writing these stories. The thing is, in the Black Company series, they're written by the analyst. So it's the person responsible for recording the events of the Black Company. Well, sometimes an analyst is gone, so someone else has to do it, or they become the new analyst. So as you go through this series, the tone will change, and the tone changes because the person telling you the story is different. This is the first time you get a woman's perspective as an analyst, and this person has a completely different background than Croker, who was the analyst for the first however many books. And her background is in like being very well educated, but also kind of a little delusional about themselves and a little naive in some places. But anyways, the book is wonderful. The Black Company as a series is magnificent. I mean, it's the reason I'm here and why I've read all his stuff. So let's just move on. Sung in Blood. This book is in DNF. I did finish it. It's not very good. I think he had it published initially in the NESFA Press, which is New England Science Fiction Association. I have a signed copy. It has like one of the ugliest covers ever. This cover's a lot better. Yes, there are airships in the book. This book is Glen Cook writing a D&D adventure. You have like 4 people that are the main cast. Each one has their own abilities. There's like the Mary Sue main character, but it makes sense that he's a Mary Sue. It's very kind of swashbuckly, cool, pulpy action, wizards, sword fights, weird assassin dudes. Like I said, airships. The whole premise is the main character's father is killed, and he is like the defender of this magical city. He has created like a shield wall out of magic that protects this place, and it is failing. And so the son has been pushed into his role as a protector ahead of schedule. And while he's trying to fill that role, he's also trying to cope with the death of his father and find out who did it and get revenge. So there's some really funny scenes in it. At one point, the main character has a companion that's like a shapeshifter, and he trolls one of the other guys in the group. The guy is hitting on a woman, and the shapeshifter turns into a child and runs up and is like, Daddy, mommy wants to know when you're coming home. And the guy gets mad and kicks what appears to be a child into the road, and he almost gets ran over by a cart, and the woman like slaps him and storms off and stuff, and it is hilarious. There's some funny humor in here, and it might be to your liking. It wasn't to mine. Maybe I'll appreciate it if I read it again. I don't know. And now we are on to Dreadbrass Shadows. I might be speeding up a little as we go on because I don't have to kind of cover the themes of these books, because I think almost all of them are in a series. There's one new series, and so maybe we'll kick it up a little in speed. Dreadbrass Shadows is a little bit convoluted, but it's still good. I'll put it in B tier because it was kind of forgetful for me. I had to basically refresh my memory on it. It does introduce a major character for the rest of the series. She's very interesting. She's like a 6'2" mercenary who is like, the way Garrett described her, is like built in all the right places or something, but she's just like a flake. She'll steal from her friends, like not even realizing she's done it because she's just trying to get paid. And it's just really interesting. She's quite the character, but other than that, it's pretty forgetful. Red Iron Knights is a very interesting book. It has a lot of the crime elements in Tunfair. So Garrett ends up helping the daughter of like the crime lord of the city. She almost gets kidnapped, and there's like this wizard who is like spitting butterflies from his mouth, like grabs her and tries to drag her into his black stagecoach to kidnap her. And you get this exploration of Tunfair. You see like yet another element of the city that Glen Cook hadn't written about before. That's one of the nice things about the Garrett series is, like I said, Ton Fair, the city is a character, and he's constantly developing it, and you're seeing these new areas, and it is almost as fun as just being there with Garrett on his weird adventures. This one feels weird, but I like it. Like I said before, like you're either into these or you're not. You can read the first two, and if you don't vibe with them, don't read any more Garrett novels. But if you like them even a little, they're fun. They're good palate cleansers. They don't get bloated until later in the series when he adds like 100 pages to the books, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But yeah, this one's good. Deadly Quicksilver Lies is like C. It's another it's a Garrett mystery. You never mind. I was refreshing my memory on this. This goes to A tier. This has one of the scariest psychological like horror things for me. At one point, Garrett gets attacked, knocked out, and he gets locked inside a mental ward where they're basically trying to leave him forever until he's forgotten about, and he does some crazy things to get out. And you know, this, now that I'm looking at it, this is 100% inspired by John D. MacDonald. Or Nightmare in Pink, which is the second book in the Travis McGee series, has an event almost identical to this. I don't want to talk about it because it's not only spoilery but pretty effed up. In this one, he incites like a riot to escape, and some patients get killed, some like caretakers get killed, all sorts of stuff. It's crazy. And yeah, this one, I had kind of been like, yeah, Red Iron Knight's good, but I was kind of slowing down, especially after Dreadbrass Shadows, and then I got to Deadly Quicksilver Lies, and I'm like, whoa, this is getting good again. And then we get to Petty Pewter Gods, which I don't know where to put it. I'm probably going to put it B tier because it's very slow and disjointed, but it has this cosmic horror element to it that just comes out of nowhere, but fits perfectly into the Garrett series, and it's terrifying. The premise is gods are real, but they have a place in the city based on how popular they are. So the less popular they are, they get moved closer to the waterfront, and eventually their religious sect just kind of gets pushed off and they're gone. And the thing is the less people believe in a god, the less they exist in our reality, well, in the reality of Garrett's world. And so what ends up happening is these gods are trying to get Garrett to find like their last follower or something, and you eventually find out why the gods are afraid of no longer being believed in, and it is amazing and terrifying. I really like it, but it's just disjointed in other places. So I got to move it a little lower. I got to save room in the A tier and S tier. I can't put everything there. Next, we got Bleak Seasons. This one takes place during the events of Dreams of Steel. When I was kind of refreshing my mind on stuff, I'm like, wait a second, I remember this going differently. And this is where the different analysts shine. This is where Glen Cook really shows you that he knows what he's about. This is the new analyst. This is S tier, and you see this analyst witnessing the same events that the analysts in Dreams of Steel do, but there's little differences, and there's no concrete evidence of who is correct. That's the thing about the Annals of the Black Company, is you are reading an interpretation by the analyst, including their biases. And so I just find that absolutely amazing that Glen Cook can write the same story from a different POV in a way that is just as compelling, and it really makes you think. And this follows my favorite protagonist in the series. So the thing about Bleak Seasons is it is my favorite book in like the second half of the Black Company series, because you're following my favorite analyst and this narrative device that he uses. Basically, this character is detached from time and space. He has witnessed an event that has been so traumatic that he no longer wants to be in reality. The tone of this is introspective and haunting, and you spend the whole book trying to figure out what it was that broke him, and then you witness it and it breaks you. Bleak Seasons is tied for me with Shadows Linger. They both have very dark tones, but very different themes. And I think that they are just some of the best writing Glen Cook has ever done. And after that, we get She is the Darkness, which I would put in A tier. I think that one of the good things about this is you spend more time with the same analyst from Bleak Seasons, and you're seeing the characters you've been following through the entire series in a new light. You're not seeing them based on how they see themselves. You're seeing them from the outside. And it goes for other characters, because this analyst is not friends with the same people in the Black Company as the other analysts. So he writes about those friends in maybe more truthful ways or maybe disparaging ways. We don't know. It's open to our interpretation. And yet again, it's another fascinating thing about the Black Company series. Next, we have Water Sleeps. I mean, it's S tier. Water Sleeps has like a big time jump, and this is where the Black Company world like really opens up and starts to blow your mind with the things that are going on. Like the character that's on this art, I won't talk about, but when I was reading this, I was just locked in a way that I hadn't been in a very long time. I love this. Glen Cook did such a magnificent job with the final 2 novels in this series. They are just something else. I'm telling you, Bleak Seasons and Shadows Linger are some of the best I've read. These are right there. And while he was writing this, your boy was like, hey, what if we put out Fated Steel Heat, which happens to be like bad. Worst Garrett book in the series. I just find it crazy that between Water Sleeps and Soldiers Live, we have such a bad book. I mean, like, if you will like it because it's a Garrett book, but the pacing is terrible. It's a hot mess. I got like whiplash from the story dragging and then flying forward. And the worst part of it all is like, this book is important. It introduces one of the most important characters for the rest of the series. And so it's not like you can skip it. Some of these you can skip, but this one you can't. But anyways, let's move on to Soldiers Live, the end of the Black Company series. It is a masterpiece. I mean, every fantasy author out there wishes they could finish a series as strongly as Glen Cook finished this one. There's going to be sequels. Lies Weeping comes out this year in 2025, and it's part of a trilogy that takes place after Soldiers Live. So it's not carrying on the story of Soldiers Live. It's starting a new story because of what happens at the end of Soldiers Live. I'm saying this is like the capstone to the Black Company series, and it's perfect. I think that this one and Water Sleeps has some of the strongest narration in the entire series. It is a different analyst, and they are wonderful. I think that the Black Company series as a whole is something a lot of people would enjoy. It does go to some very dark places. Some messed up stuff happens, but it ticks like every box a modern fantasy reader wants. It has representation of people of non-traditional genders. This book is not the white people hour. It is so good. So good. Like, you have no idea what you're getting into when you start the Black Company, and man, does it finish in just a perfect way. After that, we get Angry Lead Skies, which I put in S tier, but only because it is so strange. It's just so bizarre. It's so weird, and it sets up a lot of stuff later on. He does a really good job of making these like building blocks in every Garrett novel that starts to fall apart later. But for now, Angry Lead Skies, real good. Real crazy. If you don't like a little bit of science fiction in your fantasy, you're gonna have a bad time. But if you're already on like whatever this book is, like book 9 in the Garrett PI series, you're already invested. You ain't gonna care. So just enjoy it. After that, we got Whispering Nickel Idols. Whispering Nickel Idols is like very interesting concepts, and yet again, Glen Cook having his playground in Tunfair, but then like a very disjointed story that's forgetful. So I'll just leave that there. You know, we're getting toward the end. Winter's Dream. Winter's Dream is B tier. It is a collection of short stories from Subterranean Press. A lot of them were reprinted in The Best of Glen Cook. The story Winter's Dream itself is like an homage to Jack Vance. It has like a very science fantasy feel to it, like The Dying Earth. I really like it, so it's worth owning just for that. Also, it's a beautiful book, and yeah, the other short stories in it are good. But Winter's Dream is very good, so it's B tier. Most short story collections are like B tier because there's always stinkers that kind of drag down the bangers. Next, we have The Tyranny of the Night. I'm putting this in C tier. I don't like this series. This series is a fantasy series that takes place in Glen Cook's version of like the 1300s, 1400s. A lot of it takes place in Italy, and there is a crusade, but the crusade has to do with fighting like these elder gods or something, and there's like an ice age that's encroaching. I don't know if that was his version of the Little Ice Age, kind of amped up. The main character in this is good. It's just that I don't care, and there's way too much exposition. I mentioned that at the beginning of the video. This is the most exposition heavy of any of his books. It's like the narrator is giving you a history of events, and he's got got way too many proper nouns to the point that you stop paying attention. And so when I got to Lord of the Silent Kingdom, I DNF'd it. It's the second book in that series. I just didn't care. I got halfway through it and I'm like, man, I don't know anything that's going on other than this character. And I did it on audio, so I thought it might be that. So I cracked open the book itself and I was like, this is incomprehensible, because it's like the proper nouns are a third of every page and you're like, bro, this doesn't make sense. I might as well be reading this in another language. So I ended up DNFing the series. I'll go ahead and throw the other two books in there. I have heard that the series is rushed at the end in Working God's Mischief because there was supposed to be a fifth book, and then his publisher was like, hey, you only get one more book. And so he had to cram it all in there. So I will read them again eventually. I'm hoping that as I change as a reader, as I get older, that I'll be able to read them and enjoy them. But if not, no biggie. What is that? Like 15% of his books are stinkers? Oh, big whoop. Who cares? After that, we got Cruel Zinc Melodies, which is B tier. I really like the cast of characters and the mystery is very cool. And it introduces one of my favorite characters from the rest of the Garrett PI series. And it's just, that character is a ton of fun. But other than that, it's just all right. Next, we have Gilded Latin Bones, which is the second to last Garrett novel for now. There's supposedly another one coming out. I don't know how I'm gonna feel about it after we talk about these. This is C tier. I really like some of the things going on in here. To be generous to Glen Cook, I see what he was going for with this book, and he has some very beautiful moments in here. And Tunfair as a city has changed so much by the time you get to this, but the book is just disjointed. It's all of the kind of breakneck pacing and not holding your hand that Glen Cook does to the detriment of the book itself. It has one of my favorite characters in it, so I like it a lot. But if I'm being honest with myself, it's a C tier book. A Path to Coldness of Heart, the final book in the Dread Empire series, published 24 years later, gets A tier, borderline S tier. I think it has some issues, but to give Glen Cook credit, this man came back after a quarter of a century and finished the series, and the tone of the book is not that far off from the originals. You can tell that he has improved as a writer, and other than that, it is a good book. I really liked it. There's some weird stuff in here. Glen Cook gets real weird in this series in ways that are almost uncomfortable, but I still really liked it. I think that had he felt like writing it as the trilogy he initially wanted to, it could have been magnificent, but I don't blame him for just cramming it all into this one book and just being done and actually giving his readers what they wanted, which was some closure, man. I got some closure with this. It was so good. But I didn't get closure because here's the thing. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Dread Empire beyond what you're seeing at the surface, because he had it all planned out. Your man had a plan. And I just spent all this time thinking, well, what about this stuff? And what about this guy? And then also this book has the best implementation of magic as technology I've ever read. I love it. You actually see a bit of that in the Tyranny of the Night and the Instrumentalities of the Night series, which I liked, but the rest of it just fell apart. Anyways, Path, real good. Got a first edition, first printing. I'm pretty hyped. An Empire Unacquainted with Defeat. I'm putting this in B tier. It is a collection of short stories that take place in the Dread Empire. The S tier of this collection is at the beginning of each story, Glen Cook talks about the story, and you so rarely get to hear him talk about his writing process or his writing in general. There's like 5 interviews out there ever with him. So that's really good. Some of the stories, of course, are weak. Some are bangers, but they don't matter unless you've read all of the Dread Empire, and it takes place like all over the time and space of the series. So, you know, it's just okay. Wicked Bronze Ambition. This one is DNF. I finished it, but I finished it by skipping a third of it because, wow, this book is just not very good. I understand what he was trying to do with it, and it has moments in it that are some of the most beautiful and heartfelt writing Glen Cook has ever done. I think that the Garrett exploring like grief in a way that he's never done in the series is very ambitious, but it failed. So I went back and like skimmed the stuff that I skipped, and it was all wasted space. This book is very bloated. If it was tightened up to like the 275 pages of all the really good Garrett novels, then I think that it would have been a much better book. But anyways, yeah, it's like flawed. I don't know what happened, but we got a chunk of like stinkers in Glen Cook's writing toward the end. I don't know, maybe he's just not feeling it. It makes me very worried for the new Black Company trilogy, but I'm going to keep an open mind because like I said, it's almost like a reset for the series. I don't have to worry about it matching the tone of the originals, which brings us to Port of Shadows. It's DNF. I've read it and I liked it at the time, and then I went back to read it after I read the Black Company again, and I was like, this is is all wrong. This is following Croker as the analyst. It takes place between The Black Company and Shadows Linger. There's some weird stuff that happens. You don't read it in that order. You read it afterwards because there are things in it that are tied to the later part of the series. There's like maybe a time travel element to this. I'm not sure. I think that the parts of this book that are flashbacks to the origin story of the lady, who is like the main antagonist of the original trilogy, are brilliant, but everything else is a hot mess. It feels like he forgot how to write Croker. Croker is off. He uses like modern terminology for some stuff when it comes to the mercenaries, like FNG, which is effing new guy, and it's like, really, why? And then other stuff. The way I figured out just how much of the overall tone of the story was lost was by comparing a card game in this one with a card game in Shadows Linger. I put them side by side. It's the same cast of characters written by the same analyst. Everything is wrong about it. And so, I don't know, like, read it if you really want to. If you're in love with the Black Company series, there's a good chance you'll like it. I am in love with the Black Company series and I don't like it. I will read it again and try to be a little more, I don't know, gracious when it comes to judging it, but it's got me worried. It's really got me worried about Lies Weeping. But anyways, it's DNF. You don't have to read it to enjoy the Black Company series, but you can if you want to. The Best of Glen Cook. This is C tier. This is like rough. His science fiction stories in there, very good. There's one that has to do with like a guy who was like running away from whatever events were happening to him off planet, and it's all taking place on like this planet that's all ocean. It's really beautiful. The companionship between like the main POV character and this guy, very cool. The rest of the stories are like hit or miss. Some of them are Black Company short stories, and they're the reason it's in C tier. I think he wrote them around the same time he wrote Port of Shadows, and they tank the quality of this collection. They're not worth reading. Like, don't do it. But yet again, he does talk about each story at the beginning, so you get to get into Glen Cook's mind in a way that you don't in any other way. And as you can tell by someone who's read everything he's written, I really want to get in that man's mind, know what he was thinking about when he wrote this stuff. I mean, here we are. We are at the end of my Glen Cook journey. Was it worth it? Yeah. I think that I now have a greater appreciation for his writing style in a way that I don't know if a lot of other people do. I honestly don't know anyone else that's read his bibliography. I don't know anyone else that's read outside of the Black Company. So I'm really glad I did this. I hope that this helps anyone who wants to know more about Glen Cook as a writer. And I really, when we get down to it, if you're gonna read Glen Cook, start with the Black Company. You got to read at least the first 2 books though, because the first book is just written way different than the rest of the series. But if you get to the end of Shadows Linger and you're like, I ain't feeling it, you're like, I mean, maybe read The White Rose to complete the trilogy, but if you like the trilogy, don't stop there. I don't know what smooth brain has decided that the rest of the series isn't as good. Any single book from the second half of the Black Company series is better than the trilogy as a whole. Like, come on, man. It would be like saying, well, I read Game of Thrones, but I just don't know about Feast for Crows. Like, come on, man. Are you kidding me? Same thing with Malazan. It's like, oh yeah, I mean, I read up to Memories of Ice, but then, I don't know, the rest are just bad. It's like, are you smoking crack? If you're not a fan of fantasy, please start with Starfishers or Passage at Arms. They're magnificent. You will love them. They're super short. I mean, the Starfishers trilogy is in its own book, and it's about the size of an Expanse novel, if not a little smaller. So get a whole trilogy in one go. So good. The Garrett PI series does not have audiobooks. I think if they did, I would probably binge them annually. But everything else on here, I think, has audio, other than like a few of the niche books. The narrator for the Starfishers trilogy is wonderful. The narrator for the Dread Empire series is like S tier himself. So if you want to get into any of them, check that out. I will say the Black Company series I have not done on audio. I've only done the first book. I love the narrator for the first book, and I do know that there is a different narrator based on who is the analyst, so that's cool. I don't know what else to say. I want to thank you for going on this ridiculously long journey with me. I probably should have done a better job of covering it throughout the year. I'll link all my Glen Cook videos in the description, where I just talk about kind of my progress, my journey to get to this point. And to answer the question before it's asked, yes, I am going to be rereading The Black Company this year before the new book comes out. I plan on reading Eyes on Paper, The Black Company, because I've only ever done audio, and then I am going to listen to the rest of the series because I've never done it on audio. So that'll be fun. I'll be sharing my thoughts about those books on my reread as we go through the year. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these, what your thoughts are on Glen Cook, if you're willing to pick up any of his stuff other than the Black Company, because it's pretty good. I mean, look at what's in A tier and S tier. And I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and with that, I'll see you next time.